I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of Duran. Alexander, let's give a breakdown. Let's debrief on the G7 in France. To be quite honest, policy-wise, decision-wise, there wasn't really much done, nor were we expecting any real, outcomes, earth-shattering outcomes to take place, or any real big decisions to come out of the G7. I think it's now pretty much accepted that it's really just all for show. The G7, and boy, what a show we had in France. No one gets along. No one is coming, in the same direction. They're all going their own way. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. I think you'll describe it a lot better than I will. Everyone's just kind of on their own little tangent, on their own little planet. But once again, you had a lot of arguments in and around Russia. And Putin wasn't even there.
Well, I know.
That's the most incredible part about it.
Well, indeed.
So give the breakdown. Yeah, give the breakdown.
Yeah, but this is an extraordinary summit in many ways. I mean, to my mind, it's even worse than the disastrous summit that we had last year, which, if you remember, broke up without a communique. And we had that extraordinary photograph of Donald Trump sitting with his arms folded and with Merkel and all the others gathered around him, trying to persuade him to change his mind, and he wasn't changing his mind. But here we have different political leaders pursuing agendas that are not not only not in harmony with each other, but are now openly in conflict with each other. So Donald Trump, whose major priority at the moment is quite clearly China and Iran. So he wants to detach Russia from China, and he wants Russia's help with Iran. So he wants Russia in the G7. And he says so quite openly. He says he doesn't understand why Russia isn't there. He thinks Russia should be there. He's talking about inviting the Russians to the next G7 summit next year, which is going to be in the United States. The Europeans are furious. Macron, who invited Vladimir Putin to France just before the G7 summit took place, and who was harping on about how Russia is a European country and how its destiny belongs to the West, and how it was wonderful that Russia had rejoined the Council of Europe, was apparently very, very upset with Donald Trump for daring to suggest that the Russians should be invited to the G7 summit. And apparently he opposed it. So did Merkel, so did Boris Johnson. Conte, who was the Italian prime minister, backed Trump. Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, said nothing. Trudeau and the Australian prime minister, of course, backed the Europeans. So, I mean, you get this huge argument over Russia, which apparently became extremely tense over the course of the discussions. And it seems the person that Donald Trump had the biggest row with was Macron, and also Donald Tusk, who is the outgoing president of the European Council. So we have this flaming row over Russia. But then, of course, the Europeans who want Donald Trump to do what they want over Russia, they go out of their way to antagonize him by inviting the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Zarif, to the G7, to Besançon, to France, even though Zarif, the Iranian prime minister, has just been sanctioned by the United States. So this huge poke in the eye to the United States over this invitation to Zarif. They don't want the Russians in, but they want the Iranians in. Trump wants the Russians in, he wants the Iranians out. So we already have that quarrel. Then, of course, on top of all of that, we have Boris Johnson saying that the United States and China should cancel all the tariffs they've imposed on each other. This is the same Boris Johnson who wants a trade deal with the United States, and he's going directly against Trump's wishes on the question of tariffs. And of course, Boris Johnson is doing that at the same time as he's just had this meeting with Merkel and Macron as part of this not disastrous, this extraordinary European tour he did, in which he found both Merkel and Macron still in denial over the fact that Brexit is now looking almost certain to happen on the 31st of October, with all the prospects being that it will be a no-deal Brexit. So we see the United States with Trump, out on a limb, with the Italians and the Japanese to some extent providing some support, and the Europeans quarreling against the US over Russia, but divided between themselves, and also going in direct conflict with the United States on Iran. So we are not looking at the Western alliance anymore. We're looking at the Western disunion, because the G7, which was supposed to bring together the major leaders of the Western alliance, has never looked not just disunited, but more in conflict.
Well, you're not going to solve any of the world's problems without Russia. So let's start from there. Trump is right, correct?
Absolutely. He's absolutely
to have
right.
any kind of meeting about world issues without including Russia, without including, maybe you have the G20 format, you could argue, without having India and China. But Russia should be there if you're going to discuss serious world issues. True?
Absolutely, and no question about this. Can I just say, the Russians have expressed deep skepticism about rejoining the G7. But if you are the President of the United States, if you are the Western leaders, you ought to be pushing the Russians to rejoin, not excluding them. It's throwing Russia out of the G8, as it then was a colossal mistake, because of course you need the Russians to be there. The Russians might not want to join anymore, but in your own interests, you should be trying to draw them in. Donald Trump seems to understand that. None of the other leaders seem to understand it at all. Macron, when he was talking about this subject with Putin the other day, was making it sound like for Russia to rejoin the G7, it would be a favor done to Russia. It's not a favor done to Russia. It is in the interests of the West. And this is what Donald Trump is saying about Russia. So he is right. They are wrong.
Why is Europe still stuck in an anti-Russia mentality? Is this a factor of them hating Trump so much, Merkel and Macron, that they hate Trump so much that whatever Trump says, they'll just go against it? And I'll throw Tusk in there as well, even though Tusk to me is a non-issue. Macron and Merkel, why are they going against this? They should be ahead of Trump in trying to get Russia into the fold.
Of course they should.
Are they stuck in ideology as well? Are they stuck in stasis from the Obama era and they just don't know how to get out of it?
Well, can I just get to you? The first question you asked me is this about Trump? The answer is yes. If Barack Obama had suggested it, if it was Barack Obama at the G7 summit who was saying we need to get Russia back because we need to talk to the Russians about Iran and China and Syria and all these other problems, and Venezuela, I believe, by the way, Trump mentioned Venezuela also, then they would all agree. But because it's Trump, they all push back because they don't want to be seen to be doing what Donald Trump wants. So it is partly about Trump, and that should not be underestimated. But you are also perfectly correct that there is an element of stasis, this condition that I spoke about, this Greek word that describes a paralysis of the will, that they can't break from a policy, an anti-Russian policy, that has visibly and completely failed. And they can't bring themselves to do it, because if they did it, that would be an admission of the of the failure of that policy. And some of those leaders, specifically Angela Merkel, who are very identified with that policy, which is now unpopular in their own country. You don't have to spend much time in Germany to find out just how unpopular, would suffer huge political damage if it was formally admitted that that policy was wrong.
Does Merkel and Macron, do they gain by keeping the U.S. and Russia apart? Maybe they're playing that angle as well. And I'm saying the people above Macron and Merkel.
Yeah,
because,
I think
for me, Macron, I don't see Macron as a very, as a decision maker. He's definitely taking orders. But do you think that they may also be taking it from a different angle where they're saying, the last thing we want is for Trump and Putin to be, getting along?
Absolutely.
They're just going to squeeze us out.
I think there is a strong element of that because, as you correctly say, they are the leaders of the two great powers that have big influence in Europe. And if the United States and Russia get together and decide things in Europe, then the Europeans obviously have to go along. Let us give an example. Let's just give one example. I'm not saying this is going to happen, mind you, but let us say that Donald Trump and Putin come to an agreement together to settle the crisis in Ukraine, which involves recognizing Crimea as part of Russia and recognizing the eastern Donbass as an autonomous region within Ukraine. And they come to a formal agreement, and Trump is able to make that stick in the United States. The Europeans have no leverage in that situation whatsoever. They can't object to it because they don't have the power to object.
They're powerless. Yeah, they're insignificant.
They can maintain the illusion of power, and it is only an illusion of power, is if they can keep the Russians and the Americans at loggerheads. And of course, the past masters of this policy have been the British, who have been pursuing this objective ever since the end of the Second World War, and even before, of keeping the Russians and the Americans in conflict, so that the British can preserve some appearance of power and some appearance of independence. So there is that element, and there are certainly people in Europe, and not just in Europe, by the way, in the globalist elite we've often talked about, who do think in these terms. The very last thing they want is a Russian-American, if you like, co-condominium or co-hegemony, which will impose its views on Europe. By the way, I can remember in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, during the heyday of détente, and members of your family who were diplomats might remember this also, that was also a concern then, that Brezhnev and Nixon were working too well together for some Europeans, and that they were worried, the Europeans were worried at that time, that the US and the Russians at that time would work together too well and that the Europeans would be left out in the cold. I think this is a much bigger concern now than it was then.
Yeah, Macron and Merkel, they're just, you can tell that they're so longing for the days of Obama and Trudeau and Cameron and all these guys. They're like, they're so out of place now, and they're so distraught and confused because of the Trump factor and the factor that neoliberalism has completely collapsed. The European Union is on the verge of collapse, and they seem almost like dinosaurs. Yes. They're out of time, out of place.
Absolutely. As Putin, of course, pointed out to them in that famous interview he gave to the Financial Times a few weeks ago, which caused all this tremendous nervous crisis, that liberalism, by which, of course, he means neoliberalism and globalism, has had its day and it's over. And, of course, from their point of view, because that is the ideology that they've invested so much in and which at the same time sustains them, that is a horrifying thought for them. But they show no ability to think beyond it and to change it. And I think they desperately hope that Donald Trump will go away, that someone like Joe Biden will come in and everything will be back to what it was before 2016, and that the world, which is now from their point of view upside down, will be stood back the right way up again. It's not going to happen. It simply isn't going to happen, partly because things like Trump, Brexit, the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership that we've been talking about, all of these things are consequences of their own policies. And if they don't change those policies, those consequences will continue and will deepen, whatever happens in elections in the United States or elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be able to wait Trump out, which is what I think they're trying to do. Russia and China are getting closer by the day, by the hour, by the minute. Brexit is, 9 weeks away now?
9 weeks away, and
hard Brexit,
increasingly inevitable now. I mean, it seems irresistible. I mean, that was the big message I got from Boris Johnson's trip around Europe. The Europeans are in denial about this, but it's clear to me increasingly that it's going to happen. We've done programs about the various complicated Remainer plots to create national unity governments. Those all seem to have fallen apart. The story in Britain is that the idea of a no confidence vote against Boris Johnson's government has been put on ice and has been abandoned. There's still some talk about some complicated parliamentary trick that will stop a no-deal Brexit. If they pass a law like that, or try and pass a law like that, Boris Johnson has said very clearly he will just ignore it. So, in effect, it looks increasingly as if, despite what the Europeans think, despite what the Remainers in London want, that Brexit is now inevitable. But they can't adjust to this reality.
Yeah, then you have in Italy, you have a Salvini who's come to the forefront. He is going to be the next prime minister, barring some strange outcome. He'll be the next prime minister sooner or later. You have the elections in Canada, where if Trudeau loses, will be a big nail in the coffin of neoliberalism. Yes. I mean, all the signs are pointing to a very different world. But Macron and Merkel, and I guess that's what it is. This is a religion for them. And they can't come to terms with the fact that they have been worshiping at a false god, a false altar, a false religion, and it's falling apart.
In Macron's case, I mean, obviously he is beholden to various people who leveraged him into the presidency, but he's a true believer also, as of course is Donald Trump. Angela Merkel, I think, is slightly different in that, though I'm no doubt that at some level she is also a believer, she is someone who maneuvered herself into this position because, frankly, it seemed to her opportunistically the right thing to do in terms of her own interests. And now, of course, it's all coming apart. And we must remember that Merkel herself has said that she's going to resign soon. So, she's on the way out. But she can't break with what she's done, because for her to do so would be to admit that her entire period as Chancellor, at least since 2014, has been a hideous mistake.
I think you said Donald Trump is in that position. I think you meant Donald Tusk.
I certainly did. You're completely correct. I meant Donald Tusk. Yes. Okay. Donald Tusk is a true believer.
Yeah. Juncker, Tusk.
Yeah. Tusk is perhaps
Lagarde.
The fervent believer of them all. Donald Trump is no sort of believer in any of this. On the contrary, he regards it as all as ridiculous and is utterly dismissive of it, and he's completely wrong.
Yeah, and then I think the new people taking over at the EU are even worse. The Lagardes and the
I agree.
And all them.
That's why they were chosen. That's why they were chosen. And as has been consistently the case with the EU, they are there because they have to be more sincere in believing in this ideology than their predecessors at the time that ideology is obviously failing. That means that they are actually weaker and less impressive people, because the really impressive people, the intelligent people, no longer believe in it anymore.
I'm telling you, Alexander, October is going to be a big month. If Brexit happens, if Trudeau loses in Canada, I consider this, and we'll see how Italy unfolds. To me, these could be very, very big nails in the coffin of what has been just a terrible 8 to 10 years of neoliberal Obama ideology.
Yes, I entirely agree. And I'm going to say something else. Another country to look at, and I'm here, is Germany, because as I said, the situation here is more complicated than it looks from outside.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we push out a new video. And you can get an audio copy of this video. Go to iTunes and SoundCloud and follow us there. And please donate to the Duran, PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribe Star. The link is in the description box down below. And don't forget, go to the Duran shop, pick up a magic mug, like what I've got here, or pick up a really cool, great-looking blue polo with an embroidered double-headed eagle, like the one Alexander is wearing.
And not just a blue polo. We have wonderful blue polos. We have white ones, we have black ones, we have grey ones, and of course we've got blue ones. And we've also got T-shirts, amazingly stylish T-shirts, and long-sleeve T-shirts, and we've got hoodies, and we've got hats, and we've got stickers, and got wonderful things. And as I said I was in Germany, which I am at the moment, and this is, of course, the land of the great design. The Germans are brilliant designers. I mean, think of all the wonderful products that they produce. And here I am wearing these marvelous polo shirts, looking incredibly smart. They're 100% cotton. They got this beautiful color. You can see what amazing color this is, with our own double-headed eagle there in white, embroidered in white. In others, the black one, for example, they're gold, and they're enormously stylish T-shirts. 100% cotton, tremendously comfortable, superb products, as are our mugs. I couldn't bring my mugs with me to Germany because I daren't risk them on a bumpy trip like that. But Alex is drinking from one at the moment, keeping himself refreshed. You got wonderful 15-ounce porcelain mugs from there. I think Alex drinks coffee rather than tea, which is what I make.
Right now it's water.
Wow, there you go. So you can drink water from them. You can tea, coffee, hot chocolate, as my wife does, beer, as I have. They're fantastic mugs, and not just mugs, not just shirts, not just other things. We also sell books on our site. We've done books on Brexit. We've done books on Russiagate, really wonderful books at incredibly competitive prices. You'll learn huge amount about those topics from reading those books. So why are you holding back? Why don't you rush off to our shop, help yourself, buy all these wonderful things, and help us too, so that we can continue to give you the wonderful programs which we do. And Alex will tell you how to do it.
Just look at the description box down below. You'll see a link to the Duran shop. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Till next time, everybody. Take care.